welcome to the Mirror Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mirror Media Podcast. I'm your host, Mukunda, and today we're joined by another amazing scholar that we've done quite a bit of great scholars within Indology and South Asian religions and Hinduism on the whole. And today we're joined by Dr. McComas Taylor. He's based out of University of Australia, I believe, or maybe it's another university name. I forget. I think it's Canberra or Canberra, right?
It's the Australian National University, which is located in Canberra, our national capital.
There we go. So, it shows how little I know about many things. But no, Dr. Taylor is an amazing scholar. He has decades of deep textual knowledge. And one of the most fascinating things he's done in recent time that I think more people need to discuss is the first, I would say, translation of the Vishnu Purana in almost 200 years. Is that correct? Or
that's correct.
Yeah,
that's absolutely correct, Mukunda.
And the last one to do it was H.H. Wilson, and I have his book back here, which is much more. It's a much older English, so to speak.
English, like any language, evolves, Mukunda. And actually, I have great respect for H.H. Wilson's translation, which I believe he actually undertook with a team of unacknowledged pundits.
Right.
So it's largely his own work. It's a very good translation, but as you say, the language is very dated. But now 200 years old.
And we'll talk about this, some more in your work. But like the one thing that's fascinating about yours is I think you pull from hundreds of translations or hundreds of manuscripts, where I think Wilson had maybe eight or nine that he pulls from. He talks about that. I remember in his introduction he references. Is that correct?
That's correct. So he worked from a number of different manuscripts. Mine is actually the translation of a recently published critical edition from Baroda, from MS University in Pune. And so what they did is they got the widest possible range of manuscripts, spread them out on a table, and over a period of many years collated what they believe is the best version of the text based on those multiple manuscripts. Now, in fact, there are still errors in their critical edition, which is always a bit disappointing. There's some rather poor typographical mistakes, printing mistakes.
Sure.
But it's a good manuscript, and slightly ironically, there's not that much variation among the manuscripts of the Vishnu Purana. There's some texts like Mahabharata, Ramayana. There's great variation among the extant manuscripts. This is not the case with the Vishnu Purana, where there's maybe it's just the odd word here or there,
right?
Different, but basically the text has been very consistent over time.
Right. So before we get into the text, what's your background? How did you get into wanting to study Sanskrit and Indian traditions? I mean, I imagine, like 30, 40 years ago, it was a much more difficult space to have any sense of what's going on here. So how did you get access to this?
Well, it's a very long story, Mukunda, but to keep it short, years ago, I watched Peter Brook's 6-hour video version of Mahabharata.
Yeah.
And it finished at 1:30 in the morning. So it ran all night, finished at 1:30 in the morning. And I was absolutely blown away. I had never seen anything like it. And it was a full moon night. And I went out, I stood on the back step, and I took a vow under the full moon that I would spend the next 10 years learning Sanskrit so that I could read Mahabharata in the original. And the next morning I went out and I bought a copy of a book called teach yourself Sanskrit, which is a terrible place. That was my first mistake. It's a terrible place to start. Nobody ever got past chapter 5. So I got to chapter 5. I hit the normal brick wall that everyone hits.
Yeah.
And I found lovely tutors and mentors in Canberra, the city where I live, who took me on privately and encouraged me. And so I read Sanskrit by myself for 3 or 4 years, and I went back to university now at that stage in my late 40s.
Wow.
And I started a PhD in Sanskrit, which I finished just before I turned 50. I studied Sanskrit. I went on to study in Germany. I've studied in India. And still my first love is Mahabharata.
Yeah.
And having studied it for many years, I read the whole of Ramayana as a warm-up exercise. And I started reading Mahabharata itself about 10 years ago. I read one page every day with a Nilakanta commentary.
Right.
And I'm about 3/4 of the way through. So it's going to take me another 3 or 4 years to finish it. But Mukunda, the problem is I can't remember what I have read. So I think when I finish this reading, I'll have to go back to the beginning and start again. But so what has happened with the passage of time is the characters of Mahabharata have become like family members
Yeah.
for me. The Pandavas have become like brothers to me, is the way I feel, that sort of
So did
intimate
you
connection.
when you made that vow underneath the moon, did flowers fall from the sky? And did did you hear voices saying Jaya
Figuratively,
Jaya?
yes. Figuratively, yes. Disembodied voices sounded from the heavens, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu. No, that's that's amazing that you picked up Sanskrit in your 40s. So what were you doing before this period of time?
I have a background in Asian studies, Mukunda. So my first degree and my first love was actually classical Chinese.
Oh wow.
So I'd studied Chinese in the 1970s, 1980s. That led to an interest in Tibetan studies. So I worked and taught in Tibetan studies for the late 80s, 1990s. And Tibetan studies leads very naturally also to an interest in Sanskrit.
Of course.
And as somebody pointed out, my intellectual interests have moved south at the rate of about 200 kilometers a year
Which is
over the last 30 or 40 years.
Which is great because you're following the path of Buddhism, but backwards.
Up and backwards. That's exactly right. But there's actually there are quite a number of scholars who've taken a similar path. So the great Professor de Jong, who is the doyen of Sanskrit studies in Australia for many, many years, took a similar path. So his first degree was in Chinese studies, and then he worked on Tibetan texts, and he finally came to Sanskrit texts. So this is actually where my home is, Mukunda. It took me a long time to get here, but Sanskrit is very much my intellectual home.
Well, it's like the Lord of the Rings, where they feel near your world, right? Which is it's all about the journey.
It was certainly true.
So okay, so you got into the world of Sanskrit studies, and you fell in love with Mahabharata. Mahabharata is my first love also. It's a text that really helped me get better at my Sanskrita, because it has so many different, types of verses. Not, some are, anushtuba, some are tushubha, and then you have the various layers in the text of some, archaic, almost Vedic in some sense, and some much more modern prose. I mean, not modern, but like, modern in ancient world prose. So you have to navigate this very fascinating text and the different like methods they engage in literature, which helped me a lot. So that I think it's interesting, just because Mahabharata obviously is written by Vyasa, the son of Parashara, who wrote the Vishnu Purana. So what drew you to the Vishnu Purana? Was it through the Harivamsha, or did you come through another path?
Matter of fact, no, it didn't. It didn't come through that path. So Mukunda, I'd finished a project on oral performance of the Bhagavata Purana in about 2016. So that was a really lovely project. My colleagues, my Western colleagues, are very focused on the textual traditions, and nobody had really thought of asking how these texts are performed orally in India today. And so I'd spent 5 years working on Saptaha, so Srimad Bhagavata Saptaha, these 7-day performances, oral performances of the Bhagavata Purana. And I just finished a book published with Oxford called 7 Days of Nectar. And I didn't have a project, but I had a head full of Vaishnava narratives. And completely by chance, a colleague at Baroda in Pune asked me, they were actually looking for someone to translate their critical edition of the Vayu Purana. And I had a look at it, and it's very, very long. And I said, well, it's a great project, but it's too big for me. They said, well, what about the Vishnu Purana, which is a mere 5,000 verses? I thought, well, that's more like me. So they had actually asked me, they had invited me to translate that, and it was perfect timing for me because as I said, I just finished working on Bhagavata Purana.
Yeah.
If anything, the Vishnu Purana is like the older brother of the Bhagavata Purana, but it's in nice, easy Sanskrit that even I can understand. I do find the Bhagavata Purana quite difficult, but Vishnu Purana is in lovely, easy Sanskrit. It's nearly all in shloka meter.
Yeah.
It has good commentaries. So I felt it was a good project. And about halfway through, I suddenly realized that I love this text. I just sort of taken it on as a job, but after a while, I realized I actually love it. It's a beautiful text, and I feel really proud and happy that maybe I can bring it back into popular consciousness. People have rather forgotten about the Vishnu Purana. It has been very much overshadowed by within the faith community, overshadowed by the Bhagavata Purana, particularly the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition regards the Bhagavata Purana as very highly, and the Vishnu Purana has really slipped away. But it's a great text. It's easy to read in Sanskrit. It's got all of the great stories, narratives of the Hindu tradition. It's really it's like an introduction to Hindu traditions, because it's got the creation of the world, it's got the origin of gods and men, it's got the stories, the great stories of the Surya and the Soma Vamshas, and it's got a wonderful section, a whole book on the Leela of the pastimes of Krishna in Vrindavan. So it serves as a really nice, orderly introduction to Hindu traditions.
What's interesting is because, like, you're right, in terms of the Bhagavatam having very strong precedents, especially with the Gaudiyas, even Madhvas have a very strong affiliation for the Bhagavata. But I feel like within my tradition, which is the Sri Vaishnava tradition, the Vishnu Purana, we call it the Purana Ratna, right? It's the gem of all the Puranas, and it's actually like within Ramanuja and his subsequent followers, most of them have cited to Vishnu Purana in lieu of the Bhagavata for many places. I think it's also because the Vishnu Purana lends itself a little bit more to a Vishishtadvaitic interpretation than necessarily the Bhagavata does. It's just
well, I think that's right. I think that's right. Also, because the Vishnu Purana is somewhat earlier. And I think the fact that Shankaracharya cites the Vishnu Purana, Shankaracharya predates the Bhagavata Purana, so of course he wouldn't cite that. But yes, it certainly has had significant status in India, but really I think probably since the Bhagavata time of the Bhagavata, and particularly the time of the rise of Gaudiya Vaishnava
Right.
traditions, and the Chaitanya and the Goswamis, who really venerate the Bhagavata. Vishnu Purana has been underappreciated, and if I
Yeah.
can bring it back, if I can in any way bring it back, and help it get the popularity I believe it deserves, then I would be very happy.
Did you ever see that? I know I think in the 90s, it must have been the 90s, in Doordarshan, I think they did, B.R. Chopra did the Vishnu Purana as a serial. I remember watching bits and pieces of it. It was poor production value, of course, but it was I remember the stories coming through there too. I don't know if you ever got a
Look,
chance to
I
see it.
don't. I was not aware of that, and of course, I loved all of those old Doordarshan,
Yeah.
Mahabharata and Ramayana. They were very formative for me too, and my kids watched them when they were growing up as well. Uh, but and just on that, Mukunda, as a way of bringing this text back into popular consciousness,
Yeah.
uh, I'm also working on an audiobook version of it because it's an oral text. It should be
Right, right.
presented and enjoyed orally. And we've engaged a production company it's based in the UK,
Mhm.
but they have studios in Chennai. And I'm now working with a very talented voice artist who is recording my translation of Vishnu Purana. That'll be published as an audio book for free distribution, free
Oh, that's
download.
great.
There's no. So
Well,
I'm really looking forward to that.
well, I do appreciate like the fact that your translation of the Vishnu Purana did come out in open source, where many of these books don't. So I do think it's if I could imagine if they had came out in a regular book, in many ways would have been like a couple $100 as they are nowadays. Whether you publish through Routledge or any of these other places. So I mean that's a
Yeah.
great yeoman service you're doing for everybody.
Yes, well, I'm very pleased to be able to do that. So, the Australian National University Press is primarily an open source press. So, everything we publish is available for free download at no cost. There's also a print on demand option,
Sure.
so you can, of course, order hard copy as well. But just between me and you and your audience of listeners, my previous publications with very respectable university presses have sold in the hundreds of
Yeah.
copies. This Vishnu Purana has already been downloaded, last time I checked, 5,800 times. So it's just, if you spend years and years writing something and you care about it and you
Yeah.
want to get it out, obviously making it free makes all the difference.
Well,
And
I
it's
think
not,
five of
and
those
as you
are for me because I have it on 5 different devices. Because it's interesting for me because what I do sometimes is I pull out the Sanskrit version and then Wilson's and yours, and I compare them just to see like how the translations would differ, and also to comport sometimes with your particular passage, how you interpret the particular verse, and how Wilson does. But before we get more into Vishnu Purana, I'm really interested in finding out when you did your research on the oral tradition of the Bhagavata, uh, what was that like, and what were the salient features that really hit you when you did that research in North India? Oh, I'm guessing North India,
well,
right?
yes, it was in North India. It was around. My two main research sites were around Vrindavana
Okay,
itself, and up in Garhwal, up near Uttarkashi, in the foothills of the Himalayas.
right.
Uh, so, what was my take home from that was these are enormously popular, these Saptaha
Mhm.
events. And I think my final reason or my explanation for their popularity is they enable a member of the faith community to be both traditional and modern at the same time.
Can you
So
explain how what that means?
you can be a deeply devout uh, devotee in this tradition and at the same time you can be completely modern. You can go home to the comforts of your own home. You can talk to your friends on Skype, on WhatsApp, or whatever it is. So it somehow bridges the requirements of tradition, so this deep devotion, but enables you to live a comfortable contemporary life. You don't have to go and live in a cave in the Himalayas, or you don't have to isolate yourself. You can immerse yourself in this tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You can be a good devotee in this tradition, but still be a part of modern society. So it's enormously attractive to people in contemporary society who are looking for some forms of traditional fulfillment, I think.
So in this oral telling of the Bhagavata, is it kind of like pravachan, where they would do like the Sanskrit and then commentary in the local language, whether it's Garhwal or Hindi or whatnot? And is it just purely oral, or is it performed also?
There's the full spectrum, Mukunda. So yes, traditionally it is a pravachan or pravachanam, where a vakta or a vyas, they're called, will select stories or select verses,
Yeah.
and will either speak or sing them. But there's also a strong musical tradition where the vyas will sing and perform these verses with a musical backing. So particularly in Vrindavana, there will be musicians sitting beside or behind the vyas as he delivers as he sings or delivers his pravachanam. So there's the full spectrum, from rather dry lecture style delivery to ecstatic singing, dancing, where great waves of emotion are flowing over the audience, and everyone is up on their feet dancing and singing, really in a close to ecstatic state.
That's
So
beautiful.
there's the full spectrum.
I had my uncle who passed away years ago used to do in Karnataka. I mean, well, he did in America, which is he brought that the format of Harikatha. I think it's very similar, right? They do in Karnataka. It's probably similar to that Pravachan style. Is you would take, but he wouldn't go to, like, say, Mahabharata. He'd go to Kumaravyasa and Mahabharata. The Kannada version, where he would say from in the Kannada verse from the in that language in old Kannada, and then give like a modern Kannada telling to music to singing. It was all part of that mix, right? It was so, but each story was really, it was like a story with like one performance would be just on Bhishma and talk about Bhishma. I imagine in this version of Pravachan, would it be going through the chapters, each chapter you kind of flow through, or is there a kind of like a theme for each one of these?
It's largely based on the structure of the Purana itself. They move the Vyas, the speaker, the exponent, will move systematically from the beginning to the end. But and of course, I can't say this, but they skip over the boring bits.
Of course.
Of course, I can't. Of course, there are no boring bits in Bhagavatam, but there are bits that are more popular. Let us say more popular than others.
Sure.
And so I think there's a real focus on the stutis, on the verses of praise, for example. And there are obviously stories that are more popular than others, and everybody loves the stories of Krishna's Leela, Krishna's pastime, in Vraj. So I think it really rather builds up to the days 5 and 6 tend to be the highlight when they're talking the stories of Krishna.
Do you know of anything similar that they do with Vishnu Purana, or no? Or is this very
yes, there is. I've just discovered there was a Vishnu Purana Saptah, I think in Telugu, in fact. So the Vyas spoke the words he spoke the words of the Vishnu Purana, but his pravachanam, his explanation, was in Telugu. And I was fascinated to hear this. So there is still, or is again, a Vishnu Purana pravachana tradition. I saw an advertisement once for a Shiva Purana Pravachanam up at Uttarkashi, but that's good Shaiva country up there, so you might expect it. But these are the only two examples of Puranas that I know also have a spoken, an oral tradition.
So based on your research, do you think the Puranas on the whole and were written with this in mind, or were they even? I mean, were they originally oral tales that became written, or were they more written from the get-go? I mean, do we have any sense of any of this?
I'm always a bit skeptical about the distinction, the dichotomy between written text and oral text. So Mukunda, if I tell you a funny story and you go home and write it down, is it a written text or an oral text?
No,
and then if you tell it to someone, if you tell, so texts are both written and oral. They move between genres. It's impossible to say, I think, and I'm not sure it's the right question. Was this originally oral or was this originally written? We'll never know, and in some senses it doesn't matter. So the Vishnu Purana, or let's take the Bhagavata Purana. Yes, it's a written text, but it's also an oral text. If I speak it to you, it becomes an oral text. Well, so I'm not sure that.
I guess I'm not sure.
Oh, good. No, good. You go ahead. This dichotomy is really. I'm not sure that the dichotomy between oral and written is really a useful avenue of inquiry.
Which is, I think that's a very, very nuanced way to have the discussion, because I think one of the things like the Mahabharata, which we both love, this is one of the core arguments amongst a lot of scholars on this, right? Whether it was oral text that came from the 5th, 6th century BC that became written down during the Gupta period, or was it Alf Hillel theory, which is it's probably written the first few centuries and the last few centuries of BC, and then it's this modern debate that's been going on for quite a while. That's why I was just because Indian texts are very much all about this, right? People are always fighting about the oratory, the if it's oral or literal, or it's this. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Mukunda. They spend so much time, and I'm very fond of it. I have great respect for these scholars, but they spend entire conferences arguing these same arguments that they've been arguing for decades. There's no resolution. You can't say. Nobody will ever say. No one will ever agree. Was it oral? Was it written? And I don't think it's the right question. I don't think it's the most interesting question that could be asked. So I've rather steered clear of these discussions.
And I'm on the same page as you, because half the time the way I think about this is there's no way to prove this either way. These are vast conjectures that tend to fall upon themselves. If you want to look for layers, you'll find layers, but then you justify it by finding layers that may or may not have been. It's a very circular kind of reasoning. So I don't think it leads anywhere. So large part is, I think this is where the critical edition project really comes into play, right? Which is really, what's the latest, most complete version of a particular text, the latest meaning earliest in time, that we have that we can source. And I think that's a very interesting project, even though there's problems with it, but I think it's an interesting project.
It is an interesting project, Mukunda, and so much Indological effort has been invested in this. And I'm a little bit heretical here, because I also I don't really subscribe to the idea of the critical edition, which might seem ironic, having spent 5 years just working on translating a critical edition. I don't believe, just for the benefit of any of your listeners who may not, or viewers who may not be aware of this, the idea of a critical edition really evolved out of biblical scholarship.
Higher criticism,
century. And the idea was that if you put every known manuscript of the Gospel according to St. Mark out on your desk and compare them, you should be able to discover the original Gospel according to St. Mark, and therefore the true word of God.
Right.
Now, this technique was developed for Europe. Well, obviously I don't totally believe that either, but This approach to text was developed in Europe, in European contexts. And just at that same time, European scholars became aware of Sanskrit texts, and they applied the same text, the same approach to text. The goal being to discover the original or the oldest version of text X. Now,
Yes.
my question is, why is the original or oldest version more important than any other text? There is this cult of the original text.
Mm-hmm.
We all must find the original text. I don't believe it. In my own view, it is the Vulgate that is the more important text, the one that is most widespread, the one that is most often read, the one that is found in the most manuscripts across the broadest geographical region. This is the version of the text that has had the most social influence,
Right.
that has shaped society. So I'm much more interested in the way particular texts work. And I really have, I can't see the value in finding the oldest possible text.
Right.
And in fact, one of my earlier projects was looking at the Panchatantra, which I think everybody knows.
Right.
And what happened in the 1920s is they applied this methodology to all of the editions of the Panchatantra, and their critical edition got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till it ends up with, is it 20 or 23 stories?
Right.
And it's impoverished.
Right.
And sure, it might be the original, but it's nowhere near the most interesting. So my work on the Panchatantra, I chose the biggest one I could find that had 100 and something stories from memory. And this is the version that people know and people love. So I've never really subscribed to this idea that the oldest text should be what we strive to recover, and
Right.
that should be the basis of our understanding. I
Well,
don't buy it.
Well, I think it's just a different perspective, right? Because those scholars are looking at what they can ascertain to be the truest version, meaning like the original kind of one with some level of truth, as opposed to the more vulgate versions, which are most impactful on people, right? It just, I think it's perspectival. It's like, what are we looking for here? Or, like,
Yes, what are we looking for?
and I think
Yeah.
that question determines how you approach the text.
Yes, it does very much so. And I've been shut down in conferences for asking people why do you regard this part of the text as a contamination?
Right.
Uh, so if you take an old text and it's got more recent parts in it that don't belong, they say, oh, this has been contaminated by other texts. It's not contaminated. I think of them as improvements, actually, myself. And so I've been shut down in conferences for saying such things.
Well, it's interesting because I think I've also shifted my perspective over the years from being, well, this text is the oldest version of it, therefore it must be the right version, into being like, does it really matter? What is a text or the author's trying to tell us in this narrative or this
Mm,
story? Does it matter as much whether the one stanza wasn't in the quote unquote original, but is there net later? Maybe there was something missing in the original that someone later on decided this actually fulfills it more, right? It's the way I think about it, this is really just building what human beings do constantly. We're building on each other's knowledges
yeah,
over time, right? Knowledge doesn't remain
yeah.
static in one place, one time. It shifts to audiences and authors, and it's just, but it's a living tradition. I mean, the concept of a fixed text at one point is kind of dead, right? And this liveliness is important to have.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And on this topic, I often quote Wendy Doniger, who was a great hero of mine.
Huh?
She says that these Indian texts, particularly Puranic texts, are like early Indian Wikipedias, where generations and generations of editors and authors have added material and expanded and
Right.
expanded and expanded. And I think that's a very valid simile.
Right. No, absolutely. And on this part about text, I think we were talking about a little bit earlier before we jumped on the call about the kind of the nature of yourself, Wendy, Doniger, and a whole host of Western Indologists or scholars of South Asia and Hinduism, in conjunction with, traditional scholars within, the Hindu tradition, at some level, there is some level of tension between the two, and although
Yes.
even though there is a lot of overlap, because from my understanding, from many of the scholars I've met, from the West, many of them have went to India, especially the older generation. I think, like
Mm.
Wendy, Professor Doniger, or Sheldon Pollock, or the whole host of the older generation did go to India for maybe months or years at a time to study under traditional gurus, acharyas, whatever you want to say, panditas, to learn a text or to learn Sanskrit or to learn whatever they were studying. I mean, I don't know. From my knowledge, a lot of the work being done today by a lot of modern Indologists, they don't do that as much because I think they have the access to a lot of the studies they want here in the West. And I
Mm.
find that, so this is also my bias in some sense, and you can respond to it or not. It just, I tend to hold the scholars of your generation at higher esteem than I do much of today's scholars, because I find there's a more critical way of thinking about texts that are trying to be less reactive and more critical to trying to think about what these texts are trying to say, as opposed to what they want the text to say.
Yeah. Oh, well, there's so many things we could talk about there, Mukunda. Uh,
I don't want to put you in any hot
so
water, so whatever you feel comfortable
yeah,
with,
yeah.
you
No, I mainly associate and collaborate with scholars who are a generation younger, I
okay,
think. Uh, Frankly, uh, so there are a lot of there's the full spectrum, isn't there?
sure,
There are older generation scholars who have done, I think, the most wonderful work. I think I'm a huge fan of Bob Goldman.
yeah,
Sheldon Pollock has really, I would regard him as a lineage guru. The fact that he was one of the first to apply contemporary critical theory to Sanskrit texts is enormously important to me. Wendy Doniger, with her breadth of her mythological perspective
sure,
on Sanskrit text, her gender perspectives on Sanskrit text. I think these scholars are actually way ahead of their time, and they've really led the rest of us. Um, there are many conservative scholars in older generations. There are conservative scholars in younger generations.
sure.
But I think one of the things is this idea of cross-fertilization is important. The fact that very few people in South Asian studies, particularly in Indological or Sanskrit studies, have the time to read outside their discipline, to
Sure.
find out what's happening in European classics, what's happening in contemporary literary theory, how are people writing about texts in other traditions, because
Mhm.
there's so much to be read, and there's so little time, and
Of
there's only a
course.
finite quantum. So I think in all generations, there are scholars doing extraordinary and interesting things.
Right. No, and that's true. Like I have quite a bit of disagreement across the board with many scholars that I read. And there's things I agree with, obviously things I disagree with. But I do find the one thing that kind of, I guess, puts me on edge is when we tend to read our modern selves into ancient texts, right? And we try
Yes,
to bring our modern notions to the past as if the past is
yes,
reflecting us. And I think there's a problem with
yes,
that. And I tend to see a lot of times where, like, even some of Doniger's work, I have issues with that, because I think the way she approaches it could be her reading of the world that she came from and lived in. And we all have biases. We bring all this to the table, whatever we
yes,
do. So
yeah,
it's also about recognizing what those biases are and seeing, is this what was
yes.
actually is going on, or is this something I'm reading into it?
Yes, yeah, that's true. So whenever we read anything, we're bringing our own background
Right.
and our own prejudices, our own worldview to that, aren't we? But Mukunda, let me turn that around. For
Sure.
me, the joy in Sanskrit literature is finding friends among Sanskrit authors.
Yeah.
So I deeply love Kalidasa.
Yeah.
Whenever I see a mountain peak with a cloud wrapped around it. I, I always think, Ashlishta Sanum. I always think of that line in Meghadutam. Uh, Whenever I see clouds, gray and white clouds moving in procession across the sky, I think of that line in Rig-Veda about clouds resembling
Like
a herd
cows.
of
Yeah.
spotted cows.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that we can make these direct personal links across cultures and across millennia. I
Yeah.
think this is what I find so enriching in Sanskrit literature. Every now and then I find a voice that speaks directly to me and enriches the way I view the world and I experience the world. And for
No,
me, that's where the joy in all of this comes.
no, absolutely. And this is also I mean, what I would say a lot of my contention with traditional panditas is they're very well read in their tradition in their world, but they don't know much about the Western ideas. Like,
Mm,
for example, the comparisons between philosophers of like, Ramanuja, or you want to compare Spinoza, or who else, Aquinas, they many of them
mm,
don't have that knowledge of Western thought. And I think
mm,
the importance, especially in today, what I really am hoping to see more of in as we develop, a larger base of people that study these texts, is engagement with ideas, right? Really interesting
mm,
ideas that people have engaged with throughout time and we're still dealing with today. I feel
mm,
that that is very important, and something like the text, even Vishnu Purana, can give you insight into, like, for example, like, I think you're within your text, you talk about how, while the text itself on the whole tends to show a much more conservative vision of society and roles, it does have these moments where, like, for example, the prayer to Lakshmi by Indra, or the prayer to
mm,
Lakshmi by Maitreya and Parashara, is a very interesting perspective on femininity and
mm,
masculinity, and how they kind of
mm,
complement each other in a unique
mm,
way. And even though you might have a lot within the text are seem much more, I would say, I mean, maybe regressive is the word, maybe it's not, maybe a little more patriarchal, but there's parts where it seems a little more liberal and a little more interested in something deeper. And I want to have more discussions about those kind of things, because I think it's fascinating how these texts
yes.
like shift between these poles and they work with you.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a really good point. The praises of Lakshmi, and I think, in fact, the role that the gopis play
Yeah.
in the Krishna Lila is in some ways also very it's very gender positive in that sense. I think there are strong female role models there as well. But to step back from that,
Yeah.
there's something in these texts for everybody. They are enriching, and I think maybe the cold Western scholarly academic perspective can sometimes miss that.
Yeah.
Uh, it's the beauty and the profundity. If you're functioning entirely on uh, Dvandva compounds in early Vedic texts, or whatever your area of specialty is, don't forget uh, the broader beauty. And I come back to one of your earlier points too, Mukunda,
Yeah.
and that is the generation who could spend a year or 2 years in India as a part of their studies. That's actually much more difficult for the younger generation of scholars. But still, it's so important
Right.
to experience the light, I think, to experience the soil in which this culture grew.
Right.
I don't think you can really, it helps situate, everything written in Sanskrit is somehow situated in this Indian environment, this Indian ecology,
Right.
and to experience the heat and the cold and the rain and the thunder, it somehow enables you to make sense of the texts
Right.
in ways that you can't others. So I really encourage all of my students to, if they can, to at least visit India so they can experience the environment in which these texts evolved.
No, absolutely. And so, we've touched upon a few of the things. We haven't really got to the core of the Vishnu Purana, which I think is, we could spend a little bit of time on this right now. Is, when you got into this text and you started the translation process, what jumped out to you about this particular text that was, different or unique or enticing, that was, as opposed to like other Puranas or other Itihasas that you've engaged with?
It's very nicely structured, actually, Mukunda. So it really runs from the creation of the universe through the recreation and destruction of the universe. There's a section on the world. There is a section, so sort of a description of mythical geography,
Right.
including the stars and planets. There's a section on human society. Then there's the section on Krishna, building up to the section on Krishna. And then there's a section on the dissolution of the final dissolution of the world and moksha. So in that sense, it's very neat.
Yeah.
It really runs through time, from the beginning of time through to the end of time, with the creation, society, the world, society, and Krishna nicely nested there. So many of the other Puranas are not so well structured. They're not so well-rounded. So again, I love Bhagavata Purana, but the structure is very complex,
Right.
and it doesn't have this nice, almost chronological flow. So in that sense, it makes as a package, it's easier to handle, I think, than many other Puranas.
Now, is Vishnu Purana, it's one of the few that I recall that has all the Panchalakshanas, right? That, like you just went through your
Yes,
your
yes.
Sarga, Pratisarga, Vamsha, all that stuff, right? So, because some of the other Puranas miss one or two of these, or they do lip service to it really quickly and they move on.
Yes.
So it is there. I mean, obviously the author of this particular Purana is unique insofar as all the other Puranas are by Vyasa at some level, and in either redacting it or being a primary compiler of these texts. Vishnu Purana is unique insofar it's like pre-Vyasa. It's his dad.
Yeah, I'm not really. I don't really. Yes, but I don't really buy into this. I say attributed to,
No,
rather
yeah,
than.
no. I just mean within
Yeah.
the narrative structure. I mean, whether or not who
Yes.
wrote it, we
Yes.
have no sense. But like, according
Yeah.
to the text themselves and their narrative structure, it's
Yes.
these were all Vyasa, and this one was particularly different by Parasha.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's true. Uh, and also, it has a very simple narrative structure as well. It doesn't have a sort of a framing, much in the way of a framing
Right.
narrative. It's simply a discourse between Parashara, the sage, and Maitreya, who
Yeah.
is his chela, his shishya, his student. So it's a discourse between teacher and student. Maitreya asks questions: what is the nature of the universe? And Parashara answers. So in that sense, it's a very simple structure. But what else distinguishes it? I think it's one of the earlier Puranas. It's relatively coherent. The fourth chapter is actually, most of it is in shloka meter, but there is a large chunk of genealogical material that's in prose that also appears in the Brahma Purana. So which text borrowed from which, I don't know, and that's not my primary concern, but it is interesting to talk about this intertextuality, this
Right.
sharing of text, sharing of material among texts. But yes, I think it would be the narrative, the clarity of the chronological structure that sets it apart from most other Puranic texts.
And what also fascinates me about many of the Puranas is their core story somehow revolves around the Mahabharata. It's all reference to some part of the Mahabharata war, and the repercussions of that war, and the falling out and so on. So it's a very interesting, I think, narrative universe that all these texts are inhabiting.
That's exactly right. I really love the term narrative universe. But it's interesting how they overlap and how they don't
Yeah.
overlap. So, for example, in the Vishnu Purana, if I remember correctly, it says, "Oh yes, and Krishna also spent some time with the Pandavas," and that's it.
Yeah.
and and in Mahabharata, it says, "Oh, and Krishna also had this interesting childhood," and
Yeah.
that's it.
That's it.
So
That's it.
that's really, in fact, that's why the Harivamsha exists.
Right.
It fills that very large lacuna
Yeah.
in the Mahabharata, where the whole of Krishna's life is simply not mentioned. So, in that sense, Vishnu Purana and Mahabharatam are really complementary. One completely has the story of Krishna with the Pandavas, and one has the story of his Leela. So between the two, you get the full story.
It's very similar to, in some sense, of even the Mahabharata, the reference to the Ramayana, right? They have that small little the Rama Upakanya in Vanaparva, where Yudhishthira has told that story. It's a very condensed version of the
Oh,
Ramayana, but it's there.
absolutely. Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah,
Ramayana is also in Vishnu Purana
yeah,
in about it's like 1 or 2 chapters.
yeah.
And interestingly enough, it has a happy ending. So
Right.
it's and in the end, they all went back to Ayodhya and lived happily ever after. And so that really fascinated me when to compare that potted version of Ramayana in Vishnu Purana with Valmiki's Ramayana, for example, that
Right.
has this rather tragic denouement. So
Right.
they're quite different.
It's also, I also find it interesting across most of the Puranas, always that story of Daksha always plays a big role in
Mm.
these texts. Do you have a sense of why that is such a big moment within the these narrative frameworks?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I don't know why Daksha. In fact, Daksha has a rather complex role in the Vishnu Purana,
Right.
and I don't really know enough about how he manifests in the other traditions to speak authoritatively on that.
Right. Okay.
But it's really every story in Vishnu Purana is angled in such a way that it glorifies Vishnu. Obviously, that's why the text exists. So many of these narratives also exist in other traditions as well. And one particular narrative can be shaped to glorify Vishnu in this tradition. You can take exactly the same narrative and it can glorify Shiva in
Yeah.
another tradition, or it can glorify Devi in
Right.
another tradition. So the same narrative can adopt or can be adapted to the discursive function of the text in which it's embedded, or the tradition that is using it.
I mean, the one thing that did strike me about the Vishnu Purana compared to other ones is tends to be that even though it does glorify Vishnu, it doesn't do so at the exclusion of Shiva, or in many ways, like many of the other Vaishnavite texts do or Shaivite texts do to Vishnu. It seems to be a little more trying to balance it out, because it says in many places, like, the Atma of Shiva is Vishnu, and Vishnu's Atma is Shiva, and they're one and the same in different places, right? It seems to be much more trying to balance that out.
Yes, uh, I actually think Shiva is glorified in the Vishnu Purana, but only as a way of saying, yes, Shiva is sublime and glorious and wonderful, but is only a manifestation of Vishnu.
Right.
So the bigger you can make Shiva, you can make Vishnu even bigger still. That's my sense. It's always going to end up with Vishnu on top of the heap.
Right, right. Absolutely.
But
Um,
but yes.
no, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
No, of course, there are many mentions of Shiva right throughout Vishnu Purana, but usually the mentions are angled in such a way or inflected in such a way that they end up being praise of Vishnu.
Right. So now that you finished this project and you've just finished your Bhagavata, what else is on the horizon for you?
Well, what I'm working on at the moment, Mukunda, so I'm very involved in creating this the audio book version of Vishnu Purana, and investing quite a lot of time in getting that up and running. The next thing I would like to do is something I was unable to do with the ANU Press edition, and that is a bilingual edition of the Vishnu Purana. So having the Sanskrit on this page and the English translation on this page, so you can put them together and cross-reference them very easily. That had, in fact, been my original intention.
Right.
Was to create a bilingual edition, but for various reasons we couldn't get access to the Sanskrit text, so we had to let that go. But that will be the next thing. Once this audiobook is done, then I will be devoting myself to getting this bilingual edition up and running.
And are you gonna stick in the Vaishnavite universe, or are you moving on to a different tradition here afterwards?
We'll just have to see what happens, Mukunda. We have the World Sanskrit Conference happening in January 2023.
Okay.
For my sins, I am the chair of the local organizing committee. And of course, it was going to be in 2021, and then it was going to be in 2022, but we weren't budgeting on a pandemic.
Right.
So there's a lot of work coming up with that. We have a panel on innovations in Sanskrit narrative, and that will produce a volume. We've got a volume on Sanskrit narrative coming out also with ANU Press, probably early next year.
And is the conference going to be in Australia?
The conference will be online, Mukunda,
online
which is, and is more disappointed than I myself. We were really hoping to bring 600 or 800 Sanskrit scholars to Canberra. It's a beautiful city. I really wanted to show it off to my friends and colleagues, but the way world travel, we had to make this decision in April this year, and it was just not. We couldn't guarantee that it would be safe, that Australia would be open, that it would be accessible.
Right.
So we made the very difficult and disappointing decision to hold it online. But having made that decision, we are firmly committed to making it as excellent as we possibly can. So there'll be lots of opportunities for interaction and networking. And so we're looking forward to that in January 2023.
Is it open to lay people to come and watch and listen and partake, or is it only scholars?
No, it's very much open to anyone. There is a fee, there is a conference fee,
sure,
but it's fairly modest compared to most conferences. So of course anyone can join, and we're very easy to find. If you just Google World Sanskrit Conference 2023, you'll go straight to our website where you can register online.
Awesome. And can you tell us about your other great project that you're working on in Australian National University, which is the Sanskrit project, where you're doing quite a bit of work with people that want to learn Sanskrit online and want to engage. What exactly are you guys doing here?
Well, we've really pioneered remote learning for Sanskrit. So when I started teaching almost 20 years ago, we were the very early adopters of teaching by video conferencing.
Okay.
Very early adopters of teaching online. And when my poor colleagues started tearing their hair out at the beginning of the pandemic, how am I going to teach online? It was causing enormous anguish. It's just business as usual for us. So I've always had students all over the world joining our Sanskrit program at the ANU online. So it's really was not a big drama for us. So the way we manage our online course is we have each class is taught twice. So there's an early session which is good for people in Australia and anywhere to the east of here. So North and South Central American students join that early morning session. And I also run an evening session, which is good for students west of here. So students in India, students in Europe would come to our evening class.
So how big are your, like, if you do, I'm guessing you do like semester system where you have one.
That's right.
So how big do you get your enrollment?
I'd normally hope to have about 25 students in first year, and we would have usually 12 or 14 in second year, and 6 or 8 in third year, and maybe 4 or 5 in fourth year.
And at the end of this fourth year, do they get a degree in a bachelor's or a master's, or how does that work?
Most of our students would be doing something like a diploma of language, or they're slotting this into an Asian studies degree.
Okay.
In fact, many of our students would already have a PhD in something else anyway, and they're studying this for love. Most of our students would be mature age students who are not necessarily part of an undergraduate program.
Oh, excellent.
But let me just one more thing about our program that I think makes it pretty unique, and that is I teach Sanskrit as a living tradition. So I teach spoken Sanskrit. There's a strong emphasis on singing because, in fact, most of our texts were really written to be sung anyway. With the kavya, with the natya, with the dramas, of course, with those beautiful verses, we sing all of these. So I say I teach Sanskrit as a living tradition because many of our students are yoga teachers or yoga practitioners or coming from a Hindu or a Buddhist tradition, and they're using Sanskrit every day. So it's not, for them, it's not a dead classical textual language. It's something very much part of their life. And I'm really working to foster and encourage that active engagement with the production of Sanskrit, not just the reception of text.
So when you say you sing it, are you putting it to like Hindustani Carnatic kind of rag kind of situation, or are you trying to do it much more like a shloka chanting kind of way of doing it?
It's with the there is shloka chanting, but then when we're reading Kalidasa, for example, it's much more musical. We really sing that.
Can you give an example?
It's more than just
if you're comfortable.
Yeah.
Can you give an example?
Yes, sure. Kaschit kanta viraha guruna svadikarat pramataha shapenastam gamita mahima varsha bhogyena bhartuhu yakshashchakre janakathanaya snana punyodakeshu snigdha chaya tarushu vasatim snana punyodakeshu.
Oh, that's very nice.
So that's yeah. So that's that. I cause all my students. Australians are not very good at singing by and large, but
well, that's not true. You guys have Kylie Minogue or a few other people like that.
Yeah, also have AC/DC
and Hugh Jackman, who's good at that also. No, that's fantastic. I love it. I love that you're teaching it in an oral sense instead of just learning how to read and write and being, because many people don't know how to pronounce the words, and I love that you're teaching teaching how to pronounce it and even intonations. That's very important.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very important. So I'm very strict about pronunciation.
Yeah, well, you have to be.
If the pronunciation is not correct, the gods will not be happy.
Right.
If the gods are not happy, they will not provide rain. If there's no rain, we all know how terrible that is.
Well, that's climate change. Maybe that's because people aren't saying Sanskrit properly right now.
Maybe.
Well, Dr. Taylor, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you think that we can touch upon, or anything else you want to tell our listeners or viewers?
It's such a nice offer, Mukunda. I'm going to have to leave it there because my battery is going to die. But It was a real pleasure talking to you too, and I hope we can catch up again before too long.
Absolutely, Dr. Taylor. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
यमुना तीरे गायती वनमाली गायती वनमाली मधुरं गायती वनमाली